This screencast is to support this lesson on verb phrases to describe health, and it's on the topic of health and lifestyles. It's from Language to Go Upper Intermediate, a student's book by A. Clare, C-L-A-R-E, and J.J. Wilson, and it's published by Longman. So the lesson starts with some speaking and vocabulary, and it relates to these 4 pictures in the book. Now the materials are good, but the images are a little outdated, so you will need to update these for your lesson. So you could start the lesson by showing the 4 pictures or your versions of these and asking the students to simply talk together and describe what they can see in the pictures. And then they can move on to looking at the adjectives in the box: healthy, clean, stressful, unhealthy, exhausting, etc. And have another discussion about which adjectives they would use to describe the different lifestyles of the people in the pictures and to explain their choices to each other. Now you won't need to pre-teach many of these because they'll know them, but this one, sedentary, is a good adjective for them to know, and they probably won't know it unless it's similar to a word in their own language. So that would be worth pre-teaching before they do any work with these adjectives. So check the meaning, check the pronunciation and the spelling with them. The next activity is a small group work activity. It's quite nice. They look at some figures in a table for life expectancy. So check life expectancy, make sure they understand what that means. And think about the different lifestyles in these countries: diet, work, marriage, physical and mental health, stress, and answer the questions. So this information here gives 4 countries and the life expectancy for men and women. Now I would absolutely update this because, again, this book was written quite a long time ago, so these figures will be different, okay? And then they can answer these 3 questions in their groups. Why do you think there are differences between the different countries? Why do women live longer than men? And what could people do to live longer? So that's a nice discussion task. You could give them some time to do that in their small groups and then bring them back together to compare their ideas with the other groups. Now you've set them up nicely for the listening, because they're going to listen to a radio interview in which a doctor answers the questions they've just discussed, the 3 questions they discussed in their small groups. So these are the pointers. Make notes on what he says about the following. So these different pointers here. So they listen to the audio and they make some notes about what he says about the different points. Allow them to peer check, and while you're monitoring this you can decide whether they need to listen again, whether they've got enough information to be able to answer all of these. And if they do need to listen again, play it again, another peer check, and then get the answers. Okay, so making sure that they can see the answers on the slide. Then we move on to the language focus, which are verb phrases. Okay, and they're all on the topic of health and lifestyles that we've been discussing in the lesson. So this is a nice activity that they can do in small groups again. There's 2 parts to this activity. The first part is they have to match a word on the left with a phrase in the second column. So you can stage this as you like. You can either just give them this part to do first of all and then the third column, or you can just give them everything, making sure that you set it up really clearly and that they understand well what they need to do. So they need to match a word with one of the phrases in the second column. So for example, have a balanced diet, watch your weight, okay? And then they need to, once they've done that, discussed it and checked it together, they then match the phrase, the verb phrase, which is a phrase containing a verb, with its definition in the third column. Okay, so yeah, that's a nice activity. Make sure you do an example and that they understand what they need to do. Put them into groups, let them do it, bring them back, and then you can get some feedback to check that they've got all the answers right, making sure that they can see on the slide all the correct answers. Then you can go into the meaning, form and pronunciation. So think about concept checking questions for these phrases. You've got the definitions, and if they've matched them correctly, that's a good indication that they've understood the meaning. But some of them you will need to concept check to really make sure they've absolutely grasped the meaning. And think about the form. Okay, so, you know, as all these phrases contain a verb, you know, you might want to see if they can put one of the phrases into the past simple or the future or the present perfect, just to see if they can kind of maneuver the language appropriately in the different tenses. So just some quick fire questions. So how would I say be in good shape in a sentence? So for example, he is in good shape. Very good. And if I wanted to say that in the past, what would I say? He was in good shape. That kind of questioning, all right? Just to make them think about conjugating the verb correctly. And then you can do some drilling. So decide which ones you think would be useful to drill, and think about any features of pronunciation that will be helpful, such as sentence stress, any linking, any weak sounds, any contracted forms, etc. Now that you've gone over the rules with them, they can do some controlled practice. And the book gives 6 sentences with gaps that they have to fill with one of the expressions from the previous exercise. So one of the verb phrases. Okay, so I would use this example as your elicited example. So instead of giving them cut down on, remove that and give them this sentence with the gap, and ask them to come up with the answer. Once they've done that and you're happy that they understand what they need to do, you've checked the instructions with an example and perhaps used an ICQ, they can do that either alone and peer check after, or you can put them into pairs or small groups to do them together. And then just make sure you get some feedback and making sure that they have conjugated the verbs into the correct form. Okay. So for example, number 3, I went on holiday and forgot all about watching my weight. So yeah, just make them aware at the beginning when you're setting up the activity that they need to think about the form of the verb. Now for productive skills practice, the book offers a speaking activity, exercise 6, and a writing. They're both nice, although the speaking activity is not scaffolded in any way. So if you want them to do this, I would definitely create some questions that you want them to discuss. And you can put them into groups and they can talk about those using the expressions. Really important to demonstrate this clearly before you let them go off into their groups to discuss, to make sure that they are sure that they know that they need to use the verb phrases in their questions and answers. So what types of questions could you write? So for example, you could say, what do you do to relieve stress in your life? And the other student needs to reply, I go running to relieve stress. So they need to use the target language in the question and the answer. And get the students to expand on their answers as well. So, you know, if a student says, I go running to relieve stress, you could ask, how often do you go running? And where do you go? And how far do you run? So encourage the students while you're setting up the activity to really, really find out as much about the other students as possible, so that when they come back into the main group, they can share information about each other. So that's one option. The other option I quite like, it's design a poster or an information leaflet to form part of an advertising campaign for healthier lifestyles in your country. So you could adapt this a little bit. It could just be make a slide for using PowerPoint if it's an online course, or if you're doing it in a live classroom, they could actually physically make a poster with a big piece of paper and some marker pens, using some of the language. So you could get them into small groups and they could brainstorm ideas about how you can live a healthier lifestyle and how they can incorporate these verb phrases into the poster. Obviously, this is quite a creative task. It needs quite a lot of time. So, if you've only got 15-20 minutes, I'm not sure that would fit in, but it's certainly something to think about and perhaps adapting slightly if you'd rather do something like that than the speaking activity. But, as long as you personalise it and give it lots of scaffolding so that students have got lots of ideas about things to write about or to speak about, it will be a really interesting end of lesson activity.